All righty. Hey, everyone, and welcome to our Diversity and Inclusion webinar. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to let everyone know that NAMPWA is now accepting applications for the 2020 Summer College Internship Program, which is spearheaded by the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. If your company has a summer intern they'd like to nominate for the program, go ahead to nampwa.org to read more about the program and to complete the nomination form. The application deadline is May 31st, and this program is geared towards college students from diverse backgrounds and will connect interns to a variety of industry resources and CRE professionals. You can email info@nampwa.org with questions. Also, a big thank you to the diversity and inclusion sponsors. Our platinum sponsor, Hudson Pacific Properties. Gold sponsors, Hal Real Estate, Holland Partner Group, Stokes, Lawrence, and Touchstone. Silver sponsors, Baylis Architects, Mortenson, Moss Adams, and Pacific Project Management. And our bronze sponsors, BNBuilders, Coughlin, Lundeen, Degenkolb Engineers, DWS, HITT Contracting, Investco, and LBA Realty. So our speaker for today is Makeda Hope-Crichlow. She's a first-generation immigrant and a first-generation college graduate. She's obtained her master's in public administration from the Advent School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. Throughout her professional life, she's focused on diversity and inclusion work, both in the public and private sector. Makeda has over 200 hours of experience facilitating DEI workshops, and we're so happy to have her with us here today. Makeda, take it away.
Fabulous. Thank you, Amber. Hi, everybody. It's so strange that I can't see you all. I'm so used to being able to see everybody. So don't mind me if anything seems weird. I'm just a very social person and very used to seeing your faces. So I'm just going to imagine what all 30 of you look like just to make it more entertaining for myself. But as Amber said, I have been working in diversity and inclusion for quite some time at this point, probably about 5 years. And I very much so love to share what I know about diversity and inclusion and support others on their journeys to understanding diversity, inclusion, and understanding for themselves so they can continue that education as well. I just want to let you all know at the outset that if you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to jump them into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and we have some folks who are on the call who will be also monitoring the Q&A just to make sure that I don't miss anything. Feel free to ask your questions, while we're on the topic at hand. And then if you have questions that you think can wait till the end, you're fine to do that as well. We'll try to make sure that there's some time for us to do that as well. So let's chat, diversity and inclusion. I like to make sure that I always set objectives and expectations for the day. So the purpose of this mini workshop is to make sure that all attendees I can help y'all gain a common understanding of shared language about diversity and inclusion as a baseline to be able to have more positive conversations around these topics in your daily lives. I like to set up all of my workshops from the perspective of a no, feel, do. So what I want you to know is common language and understand basic diversity and inclusion concepts. I want you all to feel empowered to have tougher conversations around diversity and inclusion. And what I want you to do when you leave this webinar is to continue this conversation in your lives, both personal and professional, and continue your learning. It doesn't matter how long you've been learning about diversity and inclusion or even teaching about diversity and inclusion, the work is never done. So it's important to remember that you don't get to just attend a webinar and then we're all done with this work. That's not how it happens. It's continuous, and it's continuous for me as well. Of course, there are expectations. Everybody will be jumping into the chat rather than audio, I believe. So we're still going to work to create a safe space. Please be present and engaged and participate. I will ask you all questions, so please don't, not answer, and then I'll just be hanging out here by myself. That's no fun for anybody, so please engage and participate. Be open to new ideas. We will do our best to start and end on time. These always enter on a few minutes over, usually based on questions. I have the time to stay on a couple minutes later to answer folks' questions if you have them, and I'm happy to do so. And most importantly, please be comfortable with your discomfort. Things that are new can always feel strange or not that you're not aligned to them. Lean into that discomfort, and that's where most of the learning begins. So really quickly, I would like for us to take a couple minutes to reflect about how you feel about diversity and inclusion in this moment before we learn. anymore. So think really quickly about when you think about diversity and inclusion, how does it make you feel, right? And if anybody feels comfortable sharing what your immediate thoughts are in the chat, that would be great. I'll just pause for a moment so that everybody can do some quick thinking on their own and maybe contribute. Thanks for sharing your opinion, Rocal. Hopefully I'm saying that right. But absolutely, I appreciate all jumping in, Dana as well. So Raquel shared and said, challenging to have really hard conversations around diversity and inclusion. In many firms, diversity and inclusion topics seem to be under an HR umbrella and perhaps not a firm-wide topic. What's my view? I'm happy to answer that. So it does belong under HR because it is it's both, right? It belongs under HR. However, it is the responsibility of a company-wide or firm-wide, right? It belongs under HR because diversity inclusion is a people operation, right? We want to take care of our people as full humans, not just as employees. None of us are able to leave what happens to us outside of the office and not bring it inside of the office. We carry everything with us everywhere we go. So the concept that folks can, leave their personal lives outside is a very outdated way to be thinking about humans and human capital in the workplace. So it belongs under HR because it needs to be enforced. Diversity and inclusion can't just be for fun and it's not reliant only on ethics alone, because we know that it is something that's important. It is an ethical thing to be doing. However, it needs to have an enforcement structure, and that's where HR comes in. It's the way that we make sure that unconscious bias doesn't come into our policies and processes. It's the way that we make sure that there are checks and balances when it comes to performance and all of those things. HR has to be the function that enforces the equity piece of diversity and inclusion. But it takes the work of an entire company of people at large to make sure that everybody can be who they need to be in the workplace, that everybody can be included. It is not just an HR responsibility. It's firm-wide to be responsible for and HR to enforce, if that makes sense. Well, I appreciate y'all sharing with me. I love that. So what I will switch to really quickly is we'll talk about this concept of IDEA, but really what it stands for is inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And so these are kind of the pillars to think about when you think about diversity and inclusion. These all fit together in a bucket. I tend to like to talk about diversity first before I talk about inclusion. It just, is a far better acronym if it spells out IDEA. So diversity is exactly what we all think about, right? It is just a representation of many different types of people, whether it's based on gender, race, ability, or religion, whatever you can think of, right? It is simply having all these people here and present, right? And on its own, diversity doesn't have any teeth. It's important, but it cannot function by itself to drive to the outcomes that we want. Inclusion is the deliberate act of welcoming diversity and creating an environment where all different kinds of people can thrive and succeed. And so you can see there that I said, diversity is referred to as the mix, not the melting pot, and inclusion is the act of making the mix work. So if you were educated here in the United States, you often hear, history books talk about America as this melting pot. This concept that we, accepted people from all different places, and that, you just kind of come on, and just you mix into whatever this American stew is supposed to be. That is a very outdated concept, and it's also not very accurate because what that encourages is assimilation, and that's not what we want. We want people to be able to be who they are, because bringing all those different mixes to the pot is what we want, right? So more rather than a melting pot, what we're looking for is a salad bowl kind of reference, right? Like we do need those leafy greens, we need tomatoes, we need croutons, we need, a protein, all the things that you would like. Each of those pieces make a really good salad. Kale by itself doesn't do it for me, might do it for you, but for most of us, we want all the pieces to make a really delicious salad. And that's the most important piece, because you're allowed to be who you are and still contribute and be an important part of what makes the salad. Equity is the next really important piece of this conversation, and it is often a very confusing topic for folks to completely understand. So equity is how we create a level playing field for individuals or groups according to their respective needs, which may include equal treatment or treatment that is different, but is considered equivalent in terms of rights, benefits, obligations, and opportunities. And it's really important that you understand the treatment that is different but considered equivalent, because we often confuse equity with equality, and those two concepts are different, right? You can treat everybody equally, but that doesn't actually drive to equity, because we know that everybody doesn't start in the same place, right? So for instance, if I said I was going to give everybody, concert tickets, right? And let's just say we're all going to go to Bumper Shoot this year, right? Let's, for math's sake, say that a ticket to Bumper Shoot is $100. I wish it was, but it isn't. Let's say that it is. And if I talk to Amber, who's on this call, and Amber says, oh, I have $99, so I just give Amber $1 because that helps her get to the outcome to the concert. But then if I go and give everybody else $1, that will not help everybody, because somebody could have $1, another person could have $10, another person could already have $100. And by being equal and giving everybody what I gave Amber, that does not accomplish the goal of being equitable. It is equal, but it doesn't help all of us get to where we're trying to go. And so we have to understand that in order to be equitable and get to the outcome of everybody having equal opportunity under the law, we have to be discerning in how we treat groups to make sure that everybody gets the same rights and benefits and obligations and opportunities there. Happy to answer questions if that is a little confusing. It definitely can be, but I always want to drive home the difference between equity and equality, because they are not the same. Access is the last piece of this idea concept, right? And it's simply the commitment to foster attitudes and behaviors that drive the creation of procedures and policies to facilitate access to resources and opportunities across all diverse populations, right? It is the last piece of the puzzle, right? Because we can be diverse, we can work to be an inclusive environment, welcome people as they are to contribute to the best of their ability, right? We can be equitable in terms of our policies to make sure that we're creating equal opportunity. But if we don't create access to those resources, then we have pretty much lost the battle, right? So if I say I'm creating scholarships to help folks at need, but if I don't create access to those opportunities, then we're likely not going to reach the populations that we intend to reach with our efforts if we don't think about access for everybody to make sure that we create opportunities that are equal. That access piece is key to drive that home. The next concept I want to tackle is one that we hear all of the time in a variety of ways, right? So like, what exactly is privilege, right? And it's pretty simple. It is very simply a societal advantage that is granted to certain groups over others based on socioeconomic status, beauty, gender, education, or race. And that is not an exhaustive list, of course, but simply because of the groups that they belong to, rather than because of anything that they have done or failed to do. So if you have certain privileges based on your identities, you have them just for existing. It's not anything that you did or didn't do. That's how we most frequently think about privilege, but it is important to note that there are privileges that are earned versus unearned. So most commonly we are thinking about privileges that are unearned when people say that you just get them based on being born into those groups. Important to note, right, that having a privilege doesn't insinuate that you aren't hardworking or deserving. People can also experience privilege and oppression simultaneously, and you can experience a combination of privileges at the same time. So you could be white, male, Christian, wealthy, cisgender, heterosexual. All of those would be the most privileged pieces of our society at all the different cross sections of our identities. And to be clear about earned versus unearned privileges. So an unearned privilege would be race, right? You are born into the social construct of race that you're born into. I'm a Black woman. That's not my choice. I was born Black. I can't do anything about that, right? However, I do have earned privileges. I have earned 2 degrees, right? I have earned those, and there is a certain level of privilege that comes with being the owner of higher education. Having a degree gives me certain privileges. I earned that privilege, though. I wasn't born with that privilege. Another privilege could be wealth, right? You can be born into wealth, but you can also earn it. So wealth is a privilege that is both earned or unearned, depending on your status in this world, right? And at the bottom, I just always like to leave that little note because it's sometimes really hard to separate ourselves from the feelings of guilt that we may get from hearing that we're privileged people we often think that we take it personally when people say that we might have privilege, because we all believe that we have earned everything that we have, that we work hard, which I would argue that all of us on this call probably do, right? We work hard for what we earn, what we have, what we deserve. We work hard to get it, but it doesn't mean that your privileges don't have something to do with that, or that it doesn't make your efforts a little bit easier than maybe somebody else's. And so everybody with privilege might not have asked for it, but nonetheless, you've received it. So there are things that you get, or they are just less boundaries or obstacles in your path for the privileges that you have. And that's okay. You don't have to feel guilty about that, right? But we also can't be blind to the indivisible system that we're all a part of, right? So it's important to understand the privileges that you have and understand how you can use those powers for good in order to support others who don't have the same privileges that you might have. On the flip side of privilege is oppression, right? And so oppression, really simply explained, is the use of, is the result rather of the use of institutional privilege and power, where one person or group benefits at the expense of another, right? It happens at all levels, right? And then it is also reinforced by societal norms, institutional biases, interpersonal interactions, as well as individual beliefs, right? So there are primary levels of oppression, which would be what we see as the worst type of oppression, right? It's blatant, it's purposeful, it's intentional, or it can be secondary, right? Where people who are not necessarily active in that oppression, they're not actively trying to oppress others, however, they are likely to benefit from the oppression of another group, whether or not they are interested in actually making sure that that happens. I like to display the levels of oppression in kind of a stair-step form, because it makes it easy to visualize how we can escalate from individual feelings into a societal level of oppression. And so, for example, right, if you have prejudiced ideas about a group of people, but you never say them, quite frankly, obviously, no one would know, right? I can't read your brain. No one can. So I don't know what you believe about me or anybody else. You could have whatever feelings of prejudice that you might have, and they wouldn't impact anybody else, right? However, when you act on those at the interpersonal level, so for example, let's say I was a person who was an anti-Semite, right? I dislike Jews, but I don't tell anybody, no one would know. However, then if we get to the interpersonal level and I say, I'm not gonna serve any Jewish folks at my restaurant, now I'm intentionally discriminating against a person, and now I'm impacting the way that that person might be able to move through space because I'm intentionally oppressing them. Then when we have those kinds of ideas, they can level up to the institutional level, because we could be a person with power, right? You could be a person who is able to influence laws that can be passed, or in our education system, we can discriminate against a group of folks like a Jewish person or people or their children if I'm in a position of power to create structural or systemic discrimination against a group. And so if you think very quickly back to 1932 Germany, right, we watch this happen step by step, right? Individual feelings of prejudice against Jewish folks stemmed into interpersonal treatment of Jewish folks, and then institutionally we decided, like, hey, we're going to start doing things that is going to identify these folks, discriminate against these folks, segregate these folks. And then we level up to a societal level of our collective ideas about what is right. And then very quickly we end up with a Holocaust and a person in power who has very easily had been setting, these things in motion by starting at the individual level. And as a collective, we are swept into accepting certain ideas, whether or not individually you might believe them, but they have a very big impact, and it happens a lot quicker than we would imagine that it does. And then the impacts are huge, right? So it's important to remember that our individual beliefs and interpersonal actions have very far-reaching impact, and it's bigger than you would think that they might be. So I have a quick video. Hopefully it will play.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her. getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and she says, yes. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. That is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So I love this video because it talks about a lot of different kind of diversity and inclusion topics all wrapped into one, but I'm going to give you all a second to think about the video really quickly, and then I would love for you all to share a little bit about what this video made you think of, or it made you feel, or what your general thoughts are about this short video clip. I see Rebecca has dropped in the chat. I appreciate you sharing. And she said that this highlighted the ongoing opportunities that I have as a white woman to stand up for my friends and my neighbors when I see injustice. And absolutely, it totally does, right? And there are a lot of ways that these small little injustices happen, right? These little microaggressions happen, which we'll talk about. And it's really important to recognize where you have privilege and power and where you can step in and support others, where I'm sure that Joy DeGruy, actually, the woman who's talking, is a really renowned author and scholar on things surrounding race. And she, of course, has the capacity to speak up for herself. However, in that moment, her sister, being white presenting, had more power to manage that situation than she did based on visual looks alone. And sometimes that's okay to be able to understand that that is the power dynamic that's at play. Raquel shared again as well. Thank you. She said it made me cringe. Even though it is real and happens every day, it almost makes the scenario cliche. Most people to advocate on behalf of idea comes much more subtly. It totally does, right? It depends on situation, a person's comfortability in speaking up in that scenario. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable speaking up for another person, and that's not necessarily always the best choice, right, or best decision to make, because a person can easily advocate for themselves. But what is always good is if you see an injustice happen or you see something happen that is wrong, not to simply just observe and not say anything, but maybe you, if this was you at the store, maybe you didn't speak up on behalf of Joy, right? But you could stand there, and that when the manager got there, you could back her story up, right? You could share that, you know, you can be an eyewitness for the difference in the experience between her sister and her, right? You can advocate for the person when they're speaking up for themselves, so that they don't feel like they are alone managing that situation, which is often what happens. And then there's no one to back you up. And so then we can see how race and power come into play when a white person versus a Black person is giving their, you know, rendition or version of a story that happens. We often see who is more likely to be believed in that situation, and having somebody to back you up can do wonders, basically. I hope that you all keep dropping into the chat, but we're going to move along to the next thing. If it would allow me to move forward, that'd be great. The reason why I like to pick that video is because it displays a couple of different things, but most poignantly, it displays intersectionality, which is a word that we often hear thrown around, but it's essentially, it displays how we understand the varying combinations of privilege, power, and oppression, and how they interact every day in a variety of situations, right? Academically defined, it's simply the interconnected nature of social categorization, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of privilege or disadvantage, right? So for me, for instance, my identity, I am a Black woman. I identify as heterosexual. I'm a middle-class person. I identify as a Christian. Those would be all of the ways that my identities intersect when I move through space, right? Our identities are not mutually exclusive. So I'm never just a woman. I'm never just a Black person. I'm always all of these things everywhere that I go. And that impacts the way that I'm able to move through space. It impacts the perceptions that people might have about me. It also impacts the way that I perceive space. And it also can impact our life trajectories, right? All of those identities come into play. And they're the subtle nuances of how we understand space and understand other people. For instance, like I can walk into a space and yes, I'm visibly a woman or visibly present as female, but more often than not, my race comes into the room before I do. It's oftentimes that I'll walk into space and people don't think that I'm the person presenting because I'm the Black person that's in the room. I'm often not perceived as a person who will be doing the teaching. Or because I'm a young person, I am often in spaces where I'm probably the youngest person in the room and I'm leading the educating, and people are sometimes surprised that it's me simply because I'm young, right? And that's okay, but those are just the ways that my identity intersects, and it displays the way that people can perceive me or what my capacity is or why I might be somewhere, right? So it's important to remember how all these things intersect, and that also impacts our power in situations. And the way that that was displayed in the video was that her sister understood her power in that space, that she could support and advocate for her sister in a way that she would be more likely to be believed, listened to, heard, and defended than her sister would be because she is white presenting, right? So power is our capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or course of events. So that was clearly displayed in that video, right? It is the most nuanced of all D&I concepts because some folks obviously inherently have more power based on their identities than others. And it's often obviously, of course, influenced by privileges, but it is how you utilize it. It is important to make sure that we're always using our powers for good, and making sure we understand that we might have power in situations that we don't think about, understand how you might impact others. So even I think about how, I'm a pretty outspoken person. I have a pretty large personality, and I understand how it impacts others in spaces around me. I'm often a person who people want to know my opinion, and I realize that if I'm the first person to speak all the time, it sometimes influences others to not speak or to not to share their opinion, or people might default to me whether or not I have the best idea, and I understand that. So I've had to learn to be the last person to talk or to wait until somebody asks for my opinion rather than always simply deliver it first. That's not always the case, but I understand that I don't ever want to stifle anybody else in the space around me. And I have to understand how I impact space so I can support in creating a more positive outcome for folks who are in spaces with me. And that happens in a variety of ways, whether it might be men making sure that the women in the room speak up, or that if you see somebody interrupting or speaking over a woman in the room, advocate for her, right? She probably can speak up for herself, but it has a lot more power if a man in the room says, actually, I think that, you know, Rebecca has something to say, right? Or I think that Rebecca was sharing an idea and I think we should listen to what she has to say. That has a lot more impact coming from a male in the room than maybe even if Rebecca was advocating for herself. And that's simply just based on the power structures that we have in our society. And we just all have to understand how we operate and move through those spaces. And that helps us all have a more inclusive experience. And honestly, this makes us all happier, better, more productive, and feeling better as humans that interact with each other. I was going to stop right there for just a moment to see if there are any questions, any comments or things up to this point. I know that I have been talking very quickly and it's hard for me to gauge, obviously, because I can't see you all. So I just want to create an opportunity if there are any questions or comments at this juncture before we dive into the next kind of set of topics. Totally okay if there isn't. I just wanted to make sure that I'm not speaking too quickly for folks to contribute or anything like that. So I'm going to keep moving along, but feel free to ask your questions at any time. So I wanted to chat about unconscious bias with you all. This is probably one of the biggest kind of hot button buzzwords in diversity and inclusion right now. And people tend to think that it is a catch-all, or if you go to an unconscious bias training, that then you know everything, when that is not the case. But unconscious bias is a really important concept to understand, right? So it's also known as implicit social cognition or implicit bias, but it simply refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, right? These biases are created subliminally through socialization, which starts the day that we're born, right? You know, if you see blue versus pink blankets for babies, right? Right there, first minute of the life, we're saying what colors we think we associate with gender and how that impacts the way that we move through space, right? We are immediately socialized into even gender roles from the first day that we're born, and it's continuous, right? And so these biases come through socialization at school, at home, in the media, and they never stop, essentially. It's continuous into our adult lives. It's also important to note that we can be biased within our own groups. So we often think that because I'm a woman, I can't be biased against women. That would be false, right? If y'all have heard of the Harvard Implicit Association test, it's free, you should totally take it. It's also very interesting to understand where your own biases lie. I have taken the Women in the Workplace quiz a billion times, and I always come out slightly biased towards women being at home, even though I don't actually actively feel that way. I obviously think that women can be in the workplace and conquer the world, but that doesn't mean that I don't have biases unconsciously that would link women to being in the home rather than the workplace, because I've been socialized to believe that. So I want to do some myth busting on this topic as well. The myth is that implicit bias or unconscious bias is nothing more than beliefs that people choose not to tell others. They know how they feel, they just know that they can't or shouldn't say those beliefs out loud, so they hide them. That's a myth. That's simply just prejudice, right, or racism, or sexism, whatever it might be, whatever ism it is that your belief is, that's what that is. Implicit biases are activated through involuntary and they are beyond our awareness or intentional control. So it's not to be confused with outright prejudice. That's not the same. Oh, let me type my answer. Dana, it's called the Harvard Implicit Association test, but I'm gonna type it as well. And it's totally free, so it's very, very cool test to take, right? Another myth about implicit bias is that it's nothing more than stereotyping, which is false. The fact is that both implicit biases and stereotypes are types of associations that can be both positive and negative. So while it's true that unconscious bias can form as a result of exposure to persistent stereotypes, implicit bias goes beyond stereotyping to include favorable or unfavorable evaluations towards groups of people that can unconsciously impact an outcome, right? So for instance, and I could share this fact at the bottom actually. So the way that our brain works is that we create schemas in order to understand the world around us. So if anybody has been around kids, you see that they understand the world around them in categories. So for instance, if you've been around a small child and they are learning to walk and talk, they might pet a puppy and then associate anything with fur and 4 legs to be a puppy, whether it is then a rabbit, a cat, anything else, they will just call it a puppy or vice versa, because that's how they're categorizing that this soft thing with 4 legs that I can pet is okay for me to pet or touch. They are making a categorization so they can understand the space around them. That is what we do every minute of every day, because that's how our brain processes information. So the human body sends 11 million bits per second to the brain for processing. However, our conscious mind can only actually process 50 bits per second. So there is obviously a huge gap in the amount of information that we're processing consciously versus unconsciously. And the way that we can rapidly do that is to create those schemas, which helps us to understand safety versus danger, what's okay, what isn't okay, who a person is or who they aren't. All of those are based in schemas, but that is where the bias comes in, right? But it is also important to know that biases can be positive as well, right? We are trying to get rid of negative biases, but some are positive and they do keep us safe. So for instance, any woman on the call could probably talk about a time or a story or what they do when they are walking alone at night and the things that they do in order to stay safe. Whether or not there's actually a visible threat, we just know that when it is nighttime, when I'm alone, that I need to be more aware. I need to, walk with intention. You don't fiddle with your keys. You eyes up, you pay attention to your environment around you. These are all things that our brain immediately turns on and tells us that we need to do in order to stay safe, with or without a threat being there. That is a good bias to have, right? That is a schema that our brain has created, and it keeps us safe. If we didn't do that, we would not be aware of things going on around us that could potentially cause us harm. And so there's nothing wrong with having those types of schemas or biases to the spaces around us. It's when there are negative about people or individuals or groups of people that you don't know much about, or that have done you no harm, and you have negative opinions of people based on biases that have been given to you. That is then where there's a problem. So how do these biases get created? Like I mentioned, right, it comes from being socialized through a variety of different ways, right? It's pervasive, so it comes from everywhere. I already talked about pink versus blue blankets, but it's even down to pink versus blue on, toys and toy aisles, right? Target is leading the way and getting rid of the gender associations with colors. So if you go to Target now, you will never see girl toys versus boy toys. They actually no longer have those titles or hanging signs. They just simply say toys, or they'll say kid toys. There's also no longer color coordination on the ground, but there often used to be. And so there are a lot of things that are happening where people are saying we don't actually need to decide for anybody what toys they should like or shouldn't like based on what we perceive as being right or wrong for a certain gender, right? And that's just one small example of the ways that we are socialized. We're often socialized through media to think that Black and brown people are problem people because we only see Black and brown folks represented as criminals or prostitutes or the bad guys or the burglars, whatever it might be. We're seeing a clear shift in media today to show a lot more folks of color in positive lights, which is amazing. But that will not have the same impact as of yet, because it's not, that hasn't been the case for as long as we've been perceived as the problem people. So there is a lot of work that the media will have to do in order to change that. But those are positive steps in the right direction to help show other people what types of people there are through all groups and all races, and, through whatever category, whether it's LGBTQ, Black and brown people, whatever, women, however we want to describe it. Media plays a huge piece of that. And it will take a long time to help kind of turn the clock back, right? It's consistent, it's circular, so it's often self-supporting. It's also often invisible, so it's unconscious and unnamed. You don't always understand that you're being socialized to think certain things, right? It just happens. Like, why is it that there's almost always only female secretaries on TV shows? Men can be secretaries too, but we don't see them, right? We don't realize that, but it's unconscious. It's just what's happening to us. I also want to call out really quickly that we can build biases through we do build biases through our experiences, but trauma is also really important to remember is a part of that process. So we all have things that have happened to us, and in order to protect ourselves, we have biases or opinions based on whatever may or may not have happened to us, and that colors the way that we move through space. So it's important to remember that we need to remain vigilant in making sure that our traumatic experiences doesn't color the way that we see other people or categorize a group of people based on one interaction with a person. And so remembering that what happens with one person is not indicative of an entire group of people, but we do end up doing that because our brain is trying to protect us, which is okay. That is what our brain is supposed to be doing. We just have to work to, move it in the other direction so that it doesn't have such a large impact on the way that we interact with other people. Microaggressions is another kind of buzzword that we hear all the time. And I'm going to start running a little bit faster because I realize that we're almost at time. But microaggressions are essentially the firstborn child of unconscious bias. This is the way that we see our biases come out in the most interpersonal way, right? So they are simply, kind of brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights towards people of color. And the reason why I highlighted racial is because you can put gender in here, you can put sexual orientation in here, and the definition remain the same. I simply like to educate from the concept or the perspective of race because that's how I most strongly identify, and I'm the one doing the teaching. But you could replace that with any other thing and it would still be accurate, right? Important to note that microaggressions can also be seemingly positive. They are not all negative, right? Like saying that all Asians are good at math, right? Some people don't understand why that would be a negative thing to say, but that's because you're then describing an entire group of people as a monolith. There will be some Asian folks who are not good at math, and that's okay too, but then you are influencing what you think their identity should be, and then it causes some issues for folks when they aren't good at math. It makes them feel less than, like I'm not a good person, that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing simply because I don't have an aptitude that I'm somehow supposed to have, that not everybody does have, right? So even things that seemingly are positive can have very negative impacts and are negative. Microaggressions also come from the lack of an offender's ability to ask a question or make observations in an acceptable or knowledgeable way, right? Sometimes folks make jokes about things that they want to know, but they end up being inappropriate simply because we're not sure how to ask questions about what it is that we want to know about, right? We don't all interact with people of all races and genders and people of all sexual orientations. There are often things that we have no idea about and we are inclined to want to know. And so there's always a right or a wrong way to ask a question, but it's also important to note that not everything is appropriate. It's hard for folks, especially American folks. We are taught to be, very friendly, often forthcoming. If people don't want to share personal information, we are often taken aback by a lack of people's willingness to share. But it's important to check our entitlement and know that no one is actually owed personal information about anybody else. So if you ask something about a person because you want to get to know them and they choose not to share, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. You don't deserve to know anything about someone else. So it's important to always remember that as well. I'm a person who likes to ask a lot of questions, and sometimes I have to check myself and say, like, you don't need to know that. If they wanted to share that, they would share it with you, and maybe as they get to know you, they might share, and if they don't, that's okay too, but that's not your business. And sometimes we just have to accept that. And as a very friendly, outwardly sharing person, it's sometimes hard for me to understand that, but I work on it every day. I'm on my business. I did have a video that explains microaggressions in movies, but I want to be able to get through all the content, so I'm going to skip it. But if anybody is interested in the link, we can share it. It's on YouTube. It's a very funny compilation of movie clips that displays a variety of microaggressions in movies that a lot of us have probably seen, and it just makes it really easy to understand what they are. But I think we probably get the gist. The first movie was Liar Liar. So I want to just get to this last kind of segment about what can you do about all of these things, right? We're learning all about diversity, inclusion, oppression, all these different things. So what can you actually do, now that you know more, or like you understand what these biases might be and how they might show up? What can you do about it? And your biases can be reduced, right? So you can think about your biases as habits. right? And so with awareness, intention, and practice, they can be broken. Your biases are learned and they can be unlearned just like any other behavior, right? And so some research has found that there are 3 conditions that need to be in place for individuals to successfully be biased, right? So the first one is intention. So the acknowledgement that you harbor unconscious biases and have the motivation to change. So the first step is actually recognizing that you have bias. We all do. No one is exempt from it. So lean into it, understand that you have biases, do what you need to do to understand what they are, and then get motivated to change them, right? Take the Harvard Implicit Association test, take a bunch of them. They have a million different tests. There are some that are literally about presidents, like really random things that you wouldn't even think about, and that you likely have bias associated to that. It's very interesting, and we all have them, right? The second thing you need is attention. So awareness of your stereotypical responses or when assumptions are made. So when you catch yourself, and that's the one thing with intention, right? You have to be aware of your biases. The attention piece is catching yourself when these biases occur. So for example, I work as a recruiter, and in my last role, I was getting ready to do a phone interview with a candidate. And the candidate had a Asian sounding name, a difficult name. And so in my brain, I was trying to make sure I was saying it right. But before she got on the phone, I automatically turned up the volume, because in that moment, I assumed that because her name was complicated, that she would likely have an accent and I'd have a hard time hearing her or understanding. So I needed to turn the volume up. That was an immediate bias that I had based on information that doesn't verify that right or wrong. And when she got on the phone, she had a clear, like she sounded just like I sound. There was no reason for me to assume that she would have an accent. And so I checked myself in that moment, like, why would you do that, right? And like, where does that come from? Obviously, that she wouldn't have known that I did that, so she actually didn't get hurt in that exchange. But I understood that that bias occurred, and so then I have worked to not make that mistake again. Because if I had done that in person, there could be very real interpersonal impact of that, right? Making an assumption about a person that I don't know is a problem. So I pay attention when those responses come up, and I do what I can in order to de-bias myself the way that everybody else should be doing as well. And understanding to take time. It takes practice. It doesn't happen overnight, right? Like, you've got to take the time to practice different strategies or to check yourself to break any automatic associations that you might have. So some strategies that you can do is continue to take counter-stereotypic trainings like this one. So hopefully, if this group is able to do more of these trainings, you'll come to another one, right? And like I mentioned, take implicit association trainings on your own, or at least take those quizzes, right? Exposure is another strategy. It's kind of hard to do right now as we are on shelter in place, so you can't really go anywhere outside of your house. But in general, expose yourself and others to individuals and lifestyles different than your own. If you don't spend a lot of time with folks who identify as LGBTQ, but you would like to know more about those folks and understand them so that you can de-bias yourself of potential biases that you might have, do that. Go to restaurants that are typically in areas that have a higher population, or go to a bar that is outwardly a gay bar. Like, go places that you wouldn't typically go in order to expose yourself to other folks so that you can understand their lived experience. And that way you will be more empathetic, more compassionate, and in turn that will help you de-bias yourself, right? Be accountable for your biases. So work to create a culture of comfortable call out and ask for feedback along the way, right? So make sure that if you see something or you say something, you take accountability for it, or you hold another person accountable, right? And make it a habit to question your first impressions. Just like in the example that I gave, that was a first impression that I had without even seeing a person, and I immediately made an assumption. Check your first impressions always. Is how you feel about somebody based on something that they did or said, or is it based in a bias or stereotype that you already had in your brain, and you are working to, or you're watching yourself kind of try to match that person to that stereotype, right? Check why you feel how you feel about a person. It's not always going to be based in bias, of course, but sometimes it is. It's important to, double check that. Be intentionally empathetic. Empathy is way harder than it seems. So do your best to intentionally take the perspective of others. It's hard to do. As humans, we are intrinsically self-centered because we obviously live our lives from our perspective. We see the world through our eyes, not through the eyes of others. So it takes work to be able to empathize with other people and understand why somebody might disagree with you, or understand why somebody might have an opinion that is not the same as yours. Do it intentionally so that you can help understand other people better. Whether or not it will change your opinion is not the outcome, but the outcome is just to make sure that you can empathize. In the workplace, it's important to engage in deliberative processing or collaborative decision-making processes with a diverse group and encourage others to justify their decisions, right? We often work in places that are made up of likely a lot of the same types of folks. And so it's easy when you're making decisions or deciding what direction to go into that you're likely to agree with the people around you just because they likely have an opinion similar to yours. But it's important to encourage others to justify why they've made a decision. If anything, it's always to make sure that you are not missing a perspective, to make sure that you have considered everything that you need to consider, because when many people in a group have one perspective, it is more often than not that another perspective will be left out of the decision-making process, which leads to not always the best outcome. Allyship is always a very important piece in this conversation, right? So do what you can to become an active ally and encourage others around you to do the same. And that active piece is important, and I will dive into that in just a minute, right? Like how can you be an ally, and how can you be an ally that is active? So really quickly before I have to get off of here because it's almost 12, right? How to be an active ally, right? An ally is an advocate or a member of a social group that enjoys some privilege and is working to end oppression and understand their own privilege, right? However, an ally is not a person who, although they do support any discrimination, does not speak up in situations where somebody is being oppressed or displaying an oppressive bias, right? That doesn't help anybody. So you cannot call yourself an ally if you support the end of discrimination, but you don't say anything or do anything to move that, move forward towards accomplishing that. That is not an ally. No one needs a silent partner to end oppression or to end discrimination. You need every partner to be loud, or every partner to do what they can in a variety of ways to help support the ending of discrimination or racism or sexism or whatever ism we want to throw in there. It's important that we are active in that process. It's important not to mansplain, gaslight, or whitesplain as an ally. Mansplaining, really quickly, is when a man may tell a woman about her opinion or experience as if she doesn't already know what it is. Whitesplaining is the same concept, where a white person might be explaining an experience to a Black or brown person when they can advocate or when they can explain it themselves. So important to remember not to do that. And gaslighting, as a lot of us might know what it is, but it is a way to cast doubt on a person's opinion and make them feel like what they're saying isn't true. So it often happens in workplaces when somebody might speak up and say, hey, I feel discriminated against, or, you know, I've experienced this microaggression, and, you know, a response from a manager or teammate might be, are you sure you're not making it up in your head? I don't see that happening. I'm not sure that that's really true, right? You're gaslighting this person into believing that their experience is not real. Just because you don't see something happening does not mean that it is not happening, right? So be cautious to make sure that you are always giving people grace and space to share their experience with you, whether or not that you've seen it, because it's not your experience. So you will not understand it fundamentally because it isn't yours. And then the last thing, I think actually might be my last slide. I might have done it. Oh, last slide. Okay, how to be a great ally. Don't expect praise and credit for fighting inequality, because we should all be fighting inequality. You will not get you shouldn't be waiting to get a pat on the back for fighting to any inequality or driving for inclusion. It's everybody's job, right? By being an ally and doing that, you don't get credit for doing it. You can get credit from other allies, but don't expect underrepresented groups to be providing you praise and credit for doing it. They will show grace and thanks for their support, but if you don't get it, don't feel like that's like somebody's not crediting you for being a good ally. You're a good ally for fighting the good fight, right? Assume people are knowledgeable about their own oppression. So when somebody is sharing something with you about what they might be experiencing, believe them, right? Apologize when you make a mistake, correct yourself, and move on. So it's the accountability piece. If you accidentally say or do something that is discriminatory or a microaggression, right, take ownership work to apologize, come to a conclusion with the person that you might have offended, and move on. Don't dwell too much in it. I see that happen to a lot of people, and they're unable to move forward, or they're consumed by guilt. We're all humans. Everybody makes mistakes, right? So just understand that, and that this process and learning more and more about diversity and inclusion is a long one. So just know that you're on the right path moving forward. Take accountability and ownership. Forgive yourself and let it go. Follow and support leaders from target groups. So if you want to learn more about Black and Brown folks or LGBTQ folks, right, follow and support leaders from those folks, people who are leading the way to be activists to support those populations. Do that. That will be a good way to start learning more. Follow your discomfort, like I mentioned in the beginning. Lean into the feeling of being out of place or out of your depth. That's how you learn more. And last but not least, give your peers grace and space the same way that you would expect it, right, on this path. So make sure that you're giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, that people have positive intent, and give them that grace. I think that's it. I almost nailed it. It's 12:02, but those are on my slides. That is my email address if anybody has questions or wants to follow up. But I don't see any other questions in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. However, I will stop there. If there are any last minute questions, I'm happy to answer, but that is all I had for you all. And I appreciate you letting me into your space, and quite likely your living room space, and for hanging in there with me. I really appreciate it. And I always have a good time talking to folks. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Makeda.
Of course. There is a question. Let's see. Good question. So how to constructively address people when they are biased, right? So the best way to address a person when you believe that they may have some biases, especially if they're impacting you or others that are around you, the best way is to address an active incident, if that makes sense. It's really hard to help people see where their biases are if you just say, like, I think that you're racist, right? That is not really helpful or constructive, because that puts people on edge and on guard, of course, to be accosted or accused of that. It's a really hard thing for people to understand or to feel. So it's really important that you tie it to a specific instance, or you create an environment where they can understand where you're coming from by saying, you know, you haven't outright done anything, but I've noticed you make comments like this, or I've seen you say X, Y, Z, you know, call it out so that it's easy for somebody to connect tangibly to what you're trying to tell them. And then always lead with kindness, right? Like, try not to lead with anger. So sometimes we have to do the work on our own before we can address another person, right? So that you can come to the table and have a conversation that is not based in emotion, which is, I know, is very hard to do. So sometimes we have to do the work by ourselves before we can talk to the person. A good follow-up, what if they're in denial and or gaslight? That is likely to happen, which is why it's important to have a hard experience, right? Like, here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this instance that is black and white, that you can help them to see what it is that you're talking about. Leading with your experience is also really useful. So that's why I try to share as many stories about myself when I'm doing these talks, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm like somehow perfect and don't have bias and don't make mistakes. So it's really easy for people to empathize with you when you can share an experience that you have had where maybe you've done the same thing, or share your experience and how what they've done or what they've said has hurt you personally and what their impact is. And also I would like to add that remember that you can't always bring everybody along. That's probably the hardest part about this work, is understanding that every person will not get on board with this wave that we're on. Every person will not understand diversity and inclusion. They will dig in their heels. They will not be interested in understanding. And we have to be okay with that. It also, I mean, and I'm saying that, and I know that we often have people that we love that might be the ones who are digging their feet in, which makes it really difficult. But we do have to accept that you can educate people in a variety of ways, but if they are not open to receiving the information, they will not receive it. It will not land. So sometimes it's easier to send a book or an article and, you know, kind of piece by piece help a person to understand, but also know in your heart that, like, if a person doesn't want to come along, they're not going to, and you can't beat yourself up over that. So do what you can to help a person, to help a person kind of get started on this path, right? Let them know that they, it's baby steps, but remember that the outcome could be that they're not interested in coming along. And sometimes you have to leave people where they are, and that's okay. Allison had a question about how can we best apply these practices to political differences, especially when politics is so tied up in identity and can perpetuate biases. Well, that is a great question because that's one of my favorite topics. It's really easy to tie these practices to political differences because people think that identity and politics are separate, but they aren't. So displaying the ways in which you can have your beliefs about, let's say, immigration or whatever the case may be, but we can't do is discriminate against an entire group of people because you feel like it, right? Like, saying that you believe in religious freedom, which is what our Constitution allows, but then also being on board for a Muslim ban don't align, right? It's really easy to show people that you can believe what you want to believe. You can believe in small government, you can believe in big government, but when what your beliefs are impact humans based on their identity, that is where politics are no longer, like, we're not talking about politics anymore. We're very quickly moving into racism, xenophobia, homophobia, all of these things when we are talking about somebody's identity. So it's really good to lead with facts. There are a lot of facts out that you can find depending on the topic that you're thinking of. So you can lead with fact, you can lead with personal experience, and then also have the other end, right? So also have, policy and law that support either end, and lead that discussion by showing where the law that you're talking about is impacting or is meant to protect people, and what you want or what your interests are impacting a person's capacity to live their lives and be who they are based on their identity, which they don't align. That is not the purpose of the law. It should never be the purpose of the law. And we cannot politicize identity, and we shouldn't be, but we often are, obviously, in our current environment. We are often politicizing the identity of folks, which is unfair and unconstitutional. And it's very hard to argue against hard fact, hard law. And it's easy to show somebody where this is what the law says and this is what you're saying. And what you're saying is your personal opinion that is based in whatever ism that it might be. It does not align with the law. And it makes it very hard for people to say that they're right when the law is clear, right? Using facts is always a really good way to help people see where they have gone wrong. But politics is very personal, especially in this country. And that is also another space where you'll have to understand that you cannot move everybody with you. And you will have to leave some people where they are, because people will feel how they want to feel and will come up with whatever outcome they want to come up with, because it is human nature to try to find examples of what we believe to make them true, whether or not they are based in fact. And you're welcome, Allison. Happy to answer. Well, if there aren't more questions, and you think you might have some later on after you kind of think through what you've learned here today, feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to answer, happy to hop on a call and have more conversations. But otherwise, I think we might be hopping off of here. But of course, somebody said thank you. You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening to me. I appreciate it.